with cooking skills. It is nearly 2 centuries since the English mathematician and mechanical engineer Charles Babbage pointed out that the true source of savings in Adam Smith's pin factory was not simply the division of the process into simple tasks in which various laborers specialized and thus developed great skill and speed, but also in the fact that cheaper labor could be used for those components of the work requiring less skill, and that lower wage groups, in Babbage's time, women and children, could be substituted for those processes that didn't require manly strength. The same principle has been at work in school kitchens as in other food service establishments all across the country. People who have never heard of Charles Babbage have realized that if the tasks to be performed require little skill, then people of limited skills can be hired to perform them, and that these people will earn less, that is, cost less, not only because they have less skill, but also because they are more easily replaced, more interchangeable with other unskilled people, and thus they cannot successfully demand higher wages or other compensation in the form of benefits. So you really had a process of de-skilling. We're the sociology majors. A process of de-skilling and a reduction in the flow of resources to a group of people in our society who really needed those jobs. Some communities took the defrost and reheat even a step further and moved to meals that were essentially manufactured in a factory somewhere and packed up. In California, the most commonly used one is a firm called PMS, wonderful name, Prepared Meal Systems. And I just wanted to read you a description. Nancy May, the director of child nutrition in Healdsburg, California, described to me the system she found when she arrived there in the late 1990s. Quote, the prepackaged meal companies supplied the big walk-in freezer, and they supplied the big oven. And the food service employees, all they were doing was wheeling these stacks of prepackaged meals out of the freezers, wheeling them into the oven, and then wheeling them to the table. The system had taken hold in California, she said, many years ago when labor costs started to really increase. At that time, the prepackaged meal companies were starting to get real big, so they made all these proposals to school districts to serve the prepackaged meals. You can cut your labor, and that became the bottom line. Not kids, not nutrition, not kids' well-being. Okay, so I want to be clear that although there was an atmosphere of crisis in the cafeteria in the early 1980s, this was not a one-time jolt to the system. This has been a prolonged squeeze. Food service operators report all the time that they don't have enough money to do the job in the way they think it ought to be done to feed young people the kind of food that they would like to feed them, that they feel is appropriate. The latest iteration of this cost squeeze is what's called indirect costs, where some schools have begun to charge the food service department for a fee for writing the checks to employees, or for the gas and electricity that are used in the cafeteria. Those are called indirect costs from a food service point of view, and they're catching on around the country. The legacy of this change has really been a reduction in the capacity to cook on site, both in terms of the skills, because they did replace those skilled folks with much less skilled people, and in terms of the equipment. You know, when the old stove broke down, they didn't replace it because all they really needed was one of these convection ring warmers. There is one other element of the financial squeeze that came as a great surprise to me when I was doing the research for this book, and that's the need to avoid litigation. This came up for me. I interviewed a group of children in a school in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and generally speaking, I was not able to interview school students, school children directly, because they're under 18 and they're protected subjects from the point of view of my institutional review board, and I would have to get signed parental consent. And I'm not well enough organized as a researcher to do that. But in Santa Fe, there was a group of students for whom such consent had already been obtained because a journalist was coming to interview them. And then Katrina happened, and the journalist had to rush off to cover Katrina, and the school food service director thought the students would be so disappointed at not being interviewed that she asked me if I could step into that role. So I did get to meet with this group of kids at Alvaro School in Santa Fe. And they told me that the hamburgers were greasy. They didn't like the burgers because they were greasy. So afterwards, I was back in the kitchen, and the cook and the food service director wanted to know, what did they say? How did it go? And I mentioned that they thought the hamburgers were, as they put it, wet and greasy. And the cook said, oh yes, well, we put some broth on them because they were cooked months ago and frozen, and when they get defrosted, they're kind of dry. So we put some broth on them to make them more appetizing. And the cook there remembered when they had cooked their burgers fresh from raw meat on site, and she thought they had been much better. And so when I asked about it, the food service director said, oh, it's a liability issue. That if we cook the burger here and a child gets sick, the school district is liable. If a manufacturer cooked it, the manufacturer is liable. And it's fascinating to me because there had been a judgment in a school in Washington State where a child became ill and sued the school, and the principal is convinced to this day that it wasn't the meat, that it was the lettuce, but as he said, the jury wants to think it was the meat, and the judge ruled that the school was the manufacturer because the school had cooked the food. And after the word of that, and the judgment actually was half the school district's total budget for that year. So it really, in a sense, crippled the school district for a while. And so when word of that got around, food service directors all across the country decided they would move that liability upstream. I want to say there has not been a lot of contamination in school food. We hear, anytime there's a case, it's headline news, because what could be more egregious than, poisoning kids at school. But if you look at the total numbers of meals served and the total number of cases, it is really infinitesimal. But when I asked food service directors whether moving the liability upstream was primarily a liability issue, I had a number of them say they felt more comfortable with the manufacturer's capacity to control the temperature than they did with their own staff. That they were using a lot of people who were not skilled cooks and not very trained, and they weren't confident that the meat would all be cooked to the right temperature. So it's an interesting commentary on our food system, okay, and the way we live. Okay, so that's probably a good segue to the idea that not only has the financing changed, but food has changed. It's not just a series of accidents. Perhaps in your studies about the food system, you've looked at the role of federal subsidies in extending the reliance or increasing our reliance on corn and soy. You look at high fructose corn syrup? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. So by making those ingredients and some others extraordinarily cheap, the federal government could be seen as having fueled the growth of this enormous packaged good food manufacturing industry. Among the interesting qualities of soy isolates and high fructose corn syrup are that they extend the shelf life of products, and that they increase palatability because they mimic things like toastiness. Okay, it's possible to create a product that looks as if it's been recently toasted, even though in fact that's something that happened a long time ago. There's been a great evolution in our society toward more and more handheld foods. I was forced to confront some of my own perhaps inner prejudices when I interviewed a group of food service directors in Vermont, and they told me that a lot of children coming to school who were not familiar with the use of a knife and fork. And my first reaction was, wait, you know, meals, that's what separates us from other species or what have you. And, I've since come to realize that it's much more complicated than that, and that there are many cuisines around the world in which handheld foods are an important part. But in our culture, I feel like the evolution to more and more food on a stick, food you can hold, is perhaps not completely welcome.